So last week I did a story. I wanted to do like a story Wednesday, like every Wednesday, tell a story about stupid crap I did, growing up and getting in trouble. And last week I had talked about the first time I had gotten arrested and really got in some trouble. Sorry, I'm adjusting my camera here. And gotten in some trouble. But yeah, I was thinking about some stuff after I made that video. First of all, there was like a lot of stuff I left out about, one of our lifelong family friends was my attorney. He ended up being like some really big murder attorney like later on in life. So he was kind of a higher profile attorney, and just like a lot of stuff that was surrounding it. My time actually sitting in juvenile hall, what that was like. It wasn't no big deal. Honestly, like the first day I was all in tears and crying and upset because my mom couldn't get me out, and it's a weird, scary feeling. First of all, when I was younger, I used to get really homesick, and it was kind of a scary feeling knowing that everything was out of my control and I couldn't manipulate the situation. But like after like the first day there, you're kind of like, you just sit around and do nothing. And to be honest with you, one of my biggest fears about being in juvenile hall was them forcing me to go to school. So for those of you that have been watching some of my other videos, you know that my biggest issue I had as a kid growing up was school. And the reason was, for one, I didn't like sitting still that long. I had ADD, but I just wasn't good at school. Like most boys, I had no interest in reading and writing and all that stuff. So it was embarrassing, and I used to get myself in a lot of trouble to get out of those situations. I remember in middle school, there was a class that was like right before lunch. It was like a silent reading class. Mr. Newark, I want to say, was the teacher. I feel bad for this poor old guy because I used to cause issues. You were supposed to just sit there and read for half hour, 45 minutes, whatever it was. But I did everything I could to get kicked out of that class because it's embarrassing, when you're a kid and a teacher calls on you to read and you're stumbling over words in the whole class and being exposed, getting embarrassed, in front of everybody. So I would get in fights to get kicked out. And one of my biggest issues, or one thing that I used to use a lot, was I had this beanie that I got one Christmas. It was a Plan B skateboard company beanie, and it had a little weasel on it. But you're supposed to take your beanie off when you go into class and sit down, and I just wouldn't. I would refuse, and I would just argue and argue and argue till I got kicked out of class. So when I went to juvenile hall, I was like, damn, now it's not teachers, kicking me out of class. It's going to be cops, that are, or people that have a little more authority than your school teacher. And there's nowhere to kick you out to, I guess just send you to your cell or put you in solitary. So that was like, honestly, and it sounds crazy, was one of my biggest fears when I went to juvenile hall, was just being forced to do school. Yeah, and like I said, I used to get in a lot of fights when in school just to avoid it. I remember one day in a class they had sent me to another classroom to finish out the period or something like that. I used to have spiky hair, like that was like the cool trend back in the day. Like my whole hair was like about 1.5 inches long, all spiky everywhere. And I walked into this other classroom to finish out my period, and and this kid was like, you know, pretending like I got electrocuted. I smacked him upside his head, which led into a fist fight. And then I got kicked out of class, all the rest of my classes the rest of the day. In fact, I used to get in so much trouble. They had, I had gotten expelled both my 7th grade and 8th grade year. And I used it as leverage to force my mom to homeschool me. I never even stepped foot on a high school campus. Not one foot, not one day. Hold on, I gotta get the ball for the dog. Tucker dog, go get it. Go get the ball. I never stepped foot on a high school campus. Not one day did I ever go to high school. And it was because I wanted to be homeschooled. The unfortunate part there was, it was hard for my mom to homeschool me. Homeschool programs back then weren't the greatest. It's changed a lot. So that's kind of where I was going with this story. My homeschooling basically was I did PE every day. I was like, I'm gonna go skateboard, I'm gonna go ride I gotta do PE, mom, I gotta do PE, mom. I was out skateboarding, riding my dirt bikes, blah 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 blah. So my middle son, he's not struggling in school, but it's getting harder and harder to wake him up and get him to go to school. He's fine once he's there. But, you know, I always told myself that if school had ever became an issue for any of my kids like it was for me, I'm not going to force them to go to school, and I'm not going to put them through that the torture that I went through. Like I said, he's not really struggling with school, but he actually does really well in school. But we decided this year to pull him out, and we're going to homeschool him this year and kind of see how that goes. You know, another thing that was kind of an issue during my childhood, and I've seen it as an issue right now with my middle son, is there was a lot of older kids in my neighborhood, and it's not so much an issue, you know, like when, you know, they're 8 years old and or let me think of an age gap, like 10 years old, the kids are all 10 or 11 years old, and your son's, you know, 7 or 8 years old. It becomes an issue once they get into like middle school and they start going through puberty, where boys especially really start to change. And that's one of my concerns with my middle son right now, is these older boys that are all in his neighborhood. They're not bad kids, I'm not saying that at all, but they're in that going through puberty. You know, girls are a big priority, and they're not fun, innocent kids anymore. You know, like where before they would all get together and, you know, dig holes in the backyard or have water balloon fights, or they'd all sit around and play with action figures and stuff. Now they're like concerned about the way they dress and the way they look, and you know, they're more concerned about girls and, you know, the age of the internet. And that's a scary thing. You know, these boys have access to a lot more things that I did when I was that age. You know, when we had to look at, you know, adult content, it was some nudie magazines that we found out in the hills behind a pile of rocks. You know, it's nothing like it is now. And I'm trying to protect his innocence as much as I can. You know, growing up with a lot of older kids, I grew up too fast, bottom line. I was smoking pot at a young age. I was smoking cigarettes at a young age. I was drinking at a young age. You know, I had all these older kids in my neighborhood that were, you know, 3 years older than me. So when I was still young and innocent and, you know, in middle school or elementary school, these kids are already in high school and they're already starting to experiment, you know, and get into this kind of stuff. So it caused me to grow up too fast, or try to grow up too fast. And I can kind of see that happening with my middle child. He likes to he's a lot like me. He likes to show off. He likes to fit in. He likes to be the cool kid. And I was a lot like that when I was younger, and I was always trying to show off for the bigger kids, and bigger kids, they're gonna, they're hard on you, they give you a hard time. They're gonna try to influence you and talk you into doing stupid crap because they know you'll listen because you're younger. So I think keeping him home and homeschooling him from here on out should be good for him. Everyone's concern is always, homeschool kids aren't socialized. I just listened to a thing the other day about all of our greatest, minds and thinkers and stuff weren't super social people. Now, I'm not saying my son is going to be Albert Einstein, but it makes sense. A lot of intelligent people don't really care for socializing. They're more interested in thinking. And like I said, I'm not sure that that's him, but the older I get, the less social I get. And I think I was like that when I was younger, but I just was just influenced by the people around me to like want to fit in, And I think my middle son, I think him being able to like actually learn like some stuff that you need in life and not spend 8 hours a day sitting in the classroom, I think it'll be good for him. And I think he'll, like I said, he's already a really smart kid. He wasn't struggling in school at all, but I think it'll be good for him. And I think it'll help him out. He's still going to play baseball. The homeschool program that we got him in, they have like, jiu-jitsu class once a week. They have a tennis thing that my wife's trying to get him to do, but he wants no part of tennis. So I don't know about that. So yeah, I don't know, this video is kind of all over the place. It didn't really have a direction. Sorry about that. But this is just things that are on my mind, I feel bad because he always wants to go and stay the night at the older kids' houses and stuff. And I know what kind of stuff, I was sneaking out of my house at a young age to go smoke pot and drink and do all this kind of crap. And I just I'm trying to prolong his innocence as long as possible. He's a good kid. He's a smart kid. And I want it to stay that way.